generally speaking, it was a better idea, so I think you'd both agree with me. Paul McCartney is commonly pictured as the youthfully enthusiastic Beatle, the creator of the infectious basslines and infectious smile, the songwriter of yesterday, and the international superstar who revolutionized pop music, while the man behind the knighthood, stadium songs, and that irresistible smile may be charming, he is actually quite intelligent and holds strong opinions. Paul McCartney is misunderstood by those who have never worked with him, despite the generally positive impression he has. You can always count on Paul to be forthright when discussing his songs. He isn't shy about expressing his dislike for certain things. His tastes are crystal clear. Not because they didn't get along, but he has quietly disagreed with some of the biggest names in music throughout the years. They revealed significant disagreements among musicians regarding the values that music should embody. In this article, we will go over the 6 bands that Paul McCartney disliked and discuss how the charming Beatle could be cruel to some of the most famous musicians of all time. It all begins with the rivalry that shaped an era. So, are the Rolling Stones merely blues cops or serious competitors? For many years, fans viewed the rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, 2 legendary bands that were supposedly friendly rivals, as the pinnacle of musical competition. However, Paul McCartney's demeanor behind the scenes wasn't always warm and fuzzy. During a private session at Abbey Road in 1968, McCartney allegedly told them how he truly felt. The Rolling Stones, he claimed, were just a lucky blues cover band. The comment in question may not have garnered much attention at the time, but it laid the groundwork for a stress that would persist for many years to come. Paul was still putting up modest efforts in 2021. In an interview with The New Yorker, he clarified, "The Stones are a blues cover band. We expanded the size of our net a little. Not wanting to let the ongoing Ringo debate go unchallenged, Mick Jagger made sure to poke fun at it." His argument was that there were actually only 4 members of the Beatles band, plus the drummer. Paul, according to insiders, always thought the Stones were playing catch-up, releasing albums on topics the Beatles had previously explored months earlier and emulating the Beatles' new ideas. It was a furious moment in 1969 when John Lennon proposed the idea of a Rolling Stones album. According to reports, Paul became enraged and questioned John's decision to spend time with a band he perceived as imitators. Over the years, McCartney has occasionally praised a handful of Stones songs, but the tone has always retained its bite. Even when he addresses the general public, his voice trembles. It's mysterious and chilly. A punk rock assault on your person? Sex Pistols' one musical genre that truly irritated Paul McCartney was punk. It was intentionally coarse, careless, and unpolished. At its core, the Sex Pistols represented a raging rebellion that ran counter to all of Paul's decades of labor. Their scornful defiance of musical convention was more than a sound. When the Defiant Trio debuted in 1976, it was a declaration that contradicted all that McCartney and the Beatles had established. Paul felt as though he had taken a direct hit. He allegedly complained that their music was painful to his ears and asked why anyone could take pride in their incompetence. The distaste, however, extended to more than one individual. When Johnny Rotten wanted to say something, he said it straight. He referred to Paul as a dinosaur, implying that he embodied the traditional establishment that punk aimed to overthrow. Wings drummer Denny Sewell claims that the use of Beatles pictures as targets during practice by the Sex Pistols was the final straw for McCartney. His friends and family said that despite his attempts at humor, Paul was really hurting. At Air Studios in London, where both bands were recording in early 1977, Paul happened to see them in the corridor. Under his breath, Sid Vicious muttered, "Establishment sellout," while extending a helping hand. Paul averted his gaze and never looked back, so he stopped talking. Years down the road, McCartney would grudgingly acknowledge that punk had played a role in sanitizing the music industry. However, if pressed further, he would merely respond, "Not my cup of tea," while his clenched jaw and expressionless countenance conveyed far more than his words ever could. Is Oasis an insult or a copy? Paul McCartney had witnessed numerous bands attempting to emulate him, but the most vocal, boisterous, and obsessed were Oasis in the 90s. Liam and Noel Gallagher made their claim to being the Beatles' heirs public as British rock regained its prominence. They imitated the Fab Four in every way: clothing, acting, and even posing. They didn't just sound like them, it was more than that. Their mutual admiration was obvious. It was Noel who once claimed there would be no Oasis without the Beatles. To the public, it looked like praise. Paul, it wasn't quite at first. Although McCartney attempted to sound nice by praising Oasis as a great band with a lot of energy, behind closed doors, he was not happy with the band. The fixation appeared to be more of a financial scheme than a noble pursuit. Not only was there plagiarizing, but there was also an air of superiority. A famous quote from John Lennon from 1966 states, "The Beatles were bigger than Oasis." Without the finesse, Noel Gallagher boastfully stated the identical thing. That, in Paul's mind, was pride rather than honor. To him, it was unfair to compare Oasis to other bands. He claimed that their music lacked the depth and soul that gave it genuine value, instead being overly strident and self-absorbed. A buddy of his heard him say, "It's not enough to copy the chords, you've got to live the life." The Monkees, a paradise of imitation, the Monkees mocked people by making stuff up. They had a massive fan base, a successful television show, and popular songs, making them pop culture superstars. But the Monkees were merely a joke to Paul McCartney. A former Beatle, Alistair Taylor, claimed that Paul would switch the station whenever one of the band's songs came on the radio, and that Paul scoffed at them as a knockoff. He had an issue with their entire quality, not simply their sound. Paul honed his skills over many years, performing live sets in seedy Hamburg clubs where he would sleep in rooms infested with rats. But here we had four actors who pretended to be musicians and suddenly became famous. When the Monkees began to mimic the psychedelic sound of the Beatles, that's when he went completely bonkers. According to George Harrison, Paul became irate upon hearing the release of S.G.T. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and remarked, "They're stealing our blueprint without doing any of the work." The outpouring of fury manifested itself physically. Legend has it that Paul and Mickey Dolenz, lead singer of the Monkees, left a Los Angeles party together in 1968. Dolenz later said, "I don't think he ever saw us as real musicians." More importantly, McCartney's perspective remained unchanged despite the Monkees' attempts to assume songwriting responsibility. Paul used one of his famously flattering lines when asked about them in an interview in 2011. He said, "Catchy tunes, but definitely no Beatles." While his grin may have softened with time, his distaste remained constant. "Disco is coming to the Bee Gees." By the late 1970s, Paul McCartney's popularity on the charts had begun to wane. The tide had turned and disco was ruling the rock world. In the early days of disco, the Bee Gees were kings thanks to their distinctive falsettos and the massive success of Saturday Night Fever. When the Gibb brothers came out, many saw them as musical geniuses who ushered in a new era. But Paul thought they were just the Beatles stripped down, playing cover songs with glitzy vocals and electronic drums. According to Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber, Paul McCartney would joke about their songs and say things like, "Same three chords as everyone else, just faster." As the Bee Gees broke records that the Beatles had held, he was secretly growing increasingly enraged. Things escalated further in 1979 when the two singers began sharing a Miami recording studio. Rumor has it that Paul made special efforts to incorporate the Bee Gees into his lesson plan so that they wouldn't disrupt his work. From what one studio technician recalled, The Bee Gees had recently achieved something even more significant than the Beatles' previous accomplishment. What was Paul's action? He remained silent as he gritted his teeth and stared ahead. An uphill battle for the Beach Boys. The legendary Paul McCartney has gushed over God Only Knows, calling it the perfect song repeatedly. His complicated feud, which has been bothering him for decades, is hidden behind that nice praise. Upon its 1966 release, Paul considered Pet Sounds to be a major event. This was no ordinary album. Its arrangements, melodies, and emotional depth captivated him, and he listened to it repeatedly, studying each time. George Martin, the band's producer, claimed that Paul's inspiration for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came from Pet Sounds. Nevertheless, admiration swiftly transformed into rivalry as Brian Wilson began to compose his ambitious follow-up album, Smile. Paul McCartney was very engaged at first, but his enthusiasm waned after Wilson left the project due to escalating mental health issues. Supposedly, he had said, "If you can't finish what you start, you shouldn't be in this business. No matter the odds, we will not give up." Things got heated at a 1967 dinner party hosted by Brian Wilson. Paul made the unintentional comment that the Beach Boys' music was repetitive and too simplistic. The rumor mill claims that Wilson went silent for days after hearing the comments. "They had lovely harmonies," McCartney said in an interview, "but I think people overstate their influence." This seemed to be his standard response anytime asked to rate the Beach Boys. We had already made great strides. In his renditions of God Only Knows, Paul frequently includes brief disclaimers such as, "Perfect, yes, but only for American pop of that time." David Leaf, a music expert, put it best. Paul respects Brian's work, but he'll never admit how much it challenged him. For McCartney, the most hurtful truth of his rivalries was that he couldn't tolerate the person who had inspired him. If they did that, they'd have to admit that someone else had a greater impact on the Beatles. Here are the 6 bands that Paul McCartney absolutely despised. His legacy was mocked by punk rockers, his charts were eclipsed by disco stars, and he was inadvertently stoked by musical geniuses. It turns out that McCartney's private criticisms were so harsh that they reached even the most famous musicians. Artistic differences were the root cause of some feuds, while ego, plagiarism, or simple creative competition were the causes of others. Even when he acts super cool and smiles like a kid, Paul McCartney has always been very protective of the reputation he helped build. Do you have any opinions? Is there a feud that nobody saw coming? Were Paul's grievances well-founded, or were they the product of an idealist's resistance to change? Please inform us by leaving a comment below. Please like, follow, and bell. Nuggle for more obscure anecdotes and infamous conflicts in music history if you enjoyed this look into the life of a famous musician. For the simple reason that every famous person has an interesting backstory